So joining us to start our conversation today is someone who I'm very, very pleased to introduce, a longtime leader in the U.S. agricultural industry. Ray Starling serves as the Special Assistant to the President for Agriculture, Trade, and Food Assistance. He's raised on a Century farm in North Carolina, having deep roots in the industry, starting with his service with FFA as a national officer. He's been reaching out to folks around this town and throughout the country, connecting agriculture and food interests to the decision makers in the White House. During his career in law, agriculture, and agribusiness, Starling has worked as general counsel for the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, as senior ag advisor to North Carolina State Legislature, chief counsel, and chief of staff to Senator Tom Tillis. And personally, I'd just like to say, I can't think of anybody who's a better, more talented advocate for agriculture serving in the White House. Please help me welcome Ray Starling.
Thank you, Sarah, both for the introduction, which was quite generous. I think we should have more of that. And for having me. More importantly, thank you for having this event. And thank you for forging on today despite the weather. In fact, I think most of us are in a little better mood knowing that it's a snow day, right? Even if that doesn't mean anything to us, there's this mental psyche. When it's just bad weather, it's bad weather. But when it's bad weather and it becomes a snow day, it's like, hey, it's a snow day. Even though, again, that may not mean anything in terms of the differences in our schedules. Sarah was kind enough to make kind remarks about me personally. I would echo those with regard to her and her team. Certainly Agri-Pulse is something that I rely upon for information every day. I get my daily harvest. I get my daily day break, if you will. It was funny when Spencer was doing the introduction. It made me think about when the president or the vice president speak. Frequently, it will be the introduction will be the voice of God. You will literally see on the piece of paper it will say "Voice of God," and so that's your cue that it's just going to be a PA announcement introducing the president or the vice president. And when Spencer was doing that for Sarah, I was like, hey, it's the voice of God. He's introducing Sarah, but he gives me company riding in to town more frequently than he probably realizes. And so I think picking on the weather is going to be a frequent theme today. So happy spring. I wore my pink tie to celebrate. I said to a group yesterday of Farm Bureau members from Texas, just when you think Washington had run out of things to screw up, we work on the weather. So it's a rough week weather-wise. So I think we can get bipartisan and bicameral and triple branch support for the idea that this weather is ridiculous. Two funny stories about the weather that relate to my work personally. There's a group of Iowa supervisors that are coming into the White House today, and there was a big discussion late yesterday about whether that meeting would be canceled. And I don't do political affairs for the White House, but I did suggest to the team that, look, these people are from Iowa. If we cancel this meeting because of an inch or two of snow, we have more political problems than even I think we acknowledge. So there was that. And then I have a meeting late this afternoon in the Oval Office, and I got a nice little email late last night that said, it is unlikely that this meeting will be canceled due to weather. So apparently the president's commute is not really impacted by the weather. Going back just a second to Agri-Pulse and to what they bring and other ag journalists here in town bring to this conversation, I think they reflect something that most of all of us that work in ag policy find rewarding for that kind of work, and that is that generally speaking on our issues, there's very little to be gained by playing raw politics, but much to be gained by working together. We are a minority, no doubt, with regard to our numbers, but our issues are obviously big, and I think that's one thing that's rewarding is that for the most part we find ways to work across the aisle. And one of those ways we work across the aisle, frankly, is in just bragging on agriculture and talking about the contribution that it makes to the economy. We saw some of this yesterday. President Trump issued a proclamation declaring yesterday National Ag Day. I'll point out again that corresponds with the first day of spring, although no one told the weather, but we've talked about that. It is the second year in a row that the President has issued that proclamation. I encourage you to actually go read it, partly because I may or may not know folks that had something to do with what got written. But with that said, I think there's a theme throughout this administration when you hear folks like the Vice President talk as he did yesterday at USDA, when you hear the President address the Farm Bureau as he did back in January. They all acknowledge the economic significance of this sector. And as a member of the team at the National Economic Council, obviously we care about that. But I think something that you also hear consistently is this revelation, or this admitting, if you will, that there's something unique about what agriculture and farmers bring to the culture of our country, that our country is better off because of our farmers and our farm families. And so in all that we do across ag in the administration, I hope that that recognition sounds thematic. That the President understands farmers' economic contribution, but also he knows what farmers and farm families bring to the country in terms of their culture and what they add to the social fabric. If you heard the Vice President's remarks yesterday, it would have been abundantly clear that he certainly feels this way. He chose to close with quoting from Paul Harvey's "So God Made a Farmer," which we all sort of get teary-eyed when we listen to. And that really was shared over 40 years ago, as I understand it, the first time. And so with my opening remarks here, I want to just say again, sincerely, I'm not merely cheerleading. I'm not merely stalling to avoid talking about trade. I actually believe that when we focus solely on the economic contribution that agriculture makes to the country and the economic arguments that we have for our farm programs, I really think we're leaving part of our firepower and our persuasion power on the sidelines. So to refer to Harvey again, there is a rest of the story, and the Vice President said it more succinctly than I ever could, and I quote him, "Because there's something about the virtues of working the land, of having to rely on the blessings of providence, of having to wait on the weather." He went on to say that the resilience and the faith that it takes, I think it's nurtured not only people in farming, but I think it's, in a very real sense, it's nurtured the character of our nation. So the proclamation makes this point clear, but it also does go on to make some of those other points economically, that our farmers supply over $100 billion in exports to the rest of the world, that they are innovators. There are references in the proclamation about biotech and precision agriculture. So your comments and your discussion this afternoon about technology certainly track some of the things that we're thinking about and prioritizing. That rural quality of life has needs, like rural broadband and infrastructure. And of course, we couldn't help but point out the benefits of tax reform to our agricultural sector. On that last point, I see Chuck over here. I suppose we could say some people are benefiting even more than others on the tax reform. It may be too early to laugh about that, and I don't mean to be flippant about that. We certainly recognize that that is a serious issue that needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed before we get much deeper into the year. With that, in terms of my sort of introductory remarks, Sarah has me on a tight time frame. She doesn't, she's actually looks like she was starting to come up, but I haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. I don't want to give her an excuse to make me an example and be the one guy that gets jerked off the stage. I would just say the survey thing was really cool, and I noticed that in terms of the people that are here for the speakers, it was 17%. Which corresponds exactly with the percentage of the audience that is made up of speakers here this morning. All of us voted. And then apparently people want to talk about trade. So let me say on the trade topic, first and foremost, it is about time that Greg Dowd got to work. We're happy about that. You're going to get to hear him. You're going to get to hear him this afternoon. No one is more ready to show up at work than Greg Dowd has been. And I know you're waiting with bated breath to see what it is that he's going to say during his time on the program today. So I don't want to take anything away from that. But I do think that part of what you will hear from Greg is that our message to the agriculture community on trade remains what it has always been, that this president and this administration look forward to expanding opportunities for agriculture trade. We are open for business, And our end game, whether we are getting there through formal trade agreement renegotiations, through informal conversations with our partners, whether in opening new markets or in addressing non-tariff barriers that you all know so well, our end game is to create a level playing field where we believe at the end of the day our farmers will be the first to benefit. To the extent there's obviously nervousness about retaliation in terms of some of the activities the president is undertaking. To the extent that other countries want to punish our farmers for this insistence on free and fair and reciprocal trade, then obviously we plan to examine that on a case-by-case basis as those threats materialize. We will do everything within our power to protect our farmers from that sort of egregious behavior. And finally, I believe that Greg and I and others throughout the administration share the view that our best defense to the risk posed by retaliation, and Mr. McKinney I think would agree with this as well, is to work more closely with our actual trading partners, those that share our vision of free and reciprocal trade, and again continuing to explore places for our products to go. So my request for this group is that we try to be careful with the narrative here. We are pushing for free and fair trade. If that results in retaliation against us, then that tells you something about the state of free and fair trade and why I believe it is that President Trump thinks we have work to do in that regard. So as Greg comes on the scene, I encourage you to reach out to him, use him as a resource. There's no one more excited that he and Ted are in place than me. We literally are meeting later on this afternoon to talk and to visit. We've already done that one time formally, and we'll hopefully continue to do it almost on a weekly basis. Let me talk just a second about something that may not be on the top of your minds, but it is a touchstone for us in the administration, and that is the Secretary's report on ag and rural prosperity. You'll remember that this was the result of an executive order that asked Secretary Perdue to go take 6 months, talk with the ag community, talk with stakeholders, and then bring back a map of things that we could do over the course of the next few years that would benefit rural America and that would help agriculture prosper. That work continues. That was not a report that was produced and then is going to be put on a shelf and looked at. The president talked about that in January at Farm Bureau. The vice president talked about it yesterday over at USDA. We at the White House are going to continue to be involved in coordinating and monitoring the work that's coming out of some of the cross-agency initiatives that were identified there. And what I would say is it is a map. So it presents a multiple number of ways to get to the destination. Our job is to continue to use that as a touchstone and continue to come and refer back to that as it drives our agenda. Next quick topic on RFS. I want to compliment the players in this conversation. This is a contentious topic, as it should be. There's a lot at stake when we start talking about the renewable fuel standard and what it means to the American agriculture economy. I remember last year as I was getting on board at the White House, I was asked to do a presentation about American agriculture in 10 slides. And I remember reaching out to someone who's seated not too far from me right now, who's been in this role before, and asking him for a little bit of wisdom. And one of the things we agreed upon was that ethanol and renewable fuel had to be a central part of that presentation because it is now so ingrained in the economics of our ag world. Secretary Perdue and Deputy Secretary Sinsky have been tireless in trying to think about creative ways and work with the industry on creative ways that we can preserve the president's commitment to the RFS, but also to acknowledge that not everyone is a fan of the program and how it's functioning at the moment. With that said, I also want to actually praise Administrator Pruitt over at EPA and his staff. As you know, on a number of issues, he is a real friend of farmers and agriculture and agribusiness. And so while I don't want to make news on this topic this morning, I do want to do slightly more than thank all of the players for their patience. But I will just say by way of update, the search for win-win continues. To be transparent, we have been in a period of discernment, which, I kind of borrow that phrase from my pastor when we talk about going into discernment. That sort of reminds me of people talking about their faith walk. I don't generally talk about my faith walk because it's more like a stop, drop, and roll than a walk. But there is this time of discernment where we've essentially gone to the refiner industry and said, look, what can you put on the table that might give our renewable community some comfort, even if we were to negotiate some sort of truce here? And we've certainly gone to the ag sector and say, where do you have some liquidity, as Secretary Perdue likes to say it? What can you put on the table that might help us address this perceived issue? As you might imagine, those ideas that we've gotten back while we've gotten closer together, they don't necessarily directly overlap. And over the course of the next few days, we'll be looking at what those groups came up with. We'll be having more conversations, but the industry is going to be involved in that. We're going to reach out to folks, and it's certainly my intention to avoid any surprises there. I also have to touch on Farm Bill for a second. I think one of the things that I've tried to do at the White House is really make sure my peers understand there that we need to leave the committees room to maneuver. They have a hard enough job. As it is, I cannot say enough good things, particularly since the House is sort of appears to be ready to go first. Chairman Conaway, who I think so highly of, but his staff, Matt and Bart, are absolute crackerjacks. We can say the same about Troy and Ann over on Mr. Peterson's staff. Just good folks that have ag's interest at heart. We understand the certainty that getting the Farm Bill done brings. The President said in January we would like for that conversation to conclude on time. The Vice President said that again yesterday. But with that said, again, we want to give the committee room to operate and not make that conversation on the Hill any more difficult than it is. One of the last things I'll say is that many of you have been kind to reach out to me over the course of the last couple of weeks as Gary Cohn has announced that he is leaving the White House and leaving the National Economic Council. I appreciate that more than you will ever know. It was funny when Roger sat down beside me this morning. I was telling him that the seat to my right was open, and he said, well, in just a minute, your seat will be open. And I was like, do you know something I don't know, Roger? On that note, I had a chance last week to visit with Larry Kudlow. He came in for a little bit of his orientation and to meet with lawyers and ethics folks and figure out how all that system's going to work. I look forward to working with him. I felt like we had a chemistry when we first sat down. I think you should take comfort in knowing that his general framework for analyzing trade policy, ag labor needs, and regulatory reform, and even infrastructure are very similar to Gary's and for mine, for what it's worth. Now, I didn't try to get into the particulars of Title I or crop insurance with him on the Farm Bill. I didn't want to seem overly zealous while somewhat still interviewing for my job. But Kudlow's going to be a good ally for agriculture. I feel comfortable saying that already. And I frankly think it speaks very highly of the President that he would hire Mr. Kudlow knowing that he brings a different perspective on trade to the table. After meeting with him, it couldn't be more clear to me why the President offered him the job. He's going to be effective on day one, and I'm looking forward to that day one. But I also sort of hate to see Gary go. He's obviously been a good friend of ag as well and a phenomenal, phenomenal boss. Closing thoughts really at Sarah's request. She asked me to say just something about, and she's been so good about working in 4-H and FFA into these kinds of events and making sure that you all are not just present, but that you're present in the thoughts that we are having about policy development and about how we continue to support your programs. I wouldn't be standing here today were it not for those two organizations. And the quick story I'll tell is that when I was little and I was in 4-H, there was this toy and hobby share that we had down in Clinton, North Carolina. And you brought a toy and you stood in front of a panel of judges and you explained to them why you liked that toy and you gave them a chance to hold the toy. Well, my mom drugged me down to this event and I had something called an idiot stick, which is one of these little things you presumably hook it on a rubber band and then it flies back in, but there's really no rubber band. There's just a little trick you have to, and none of the judges got it, so I was like the star of the show because I could do the idiot stick and they couldn't, and I was like 9 years old. So it was a lot of fun. I ended up winning that particular competition, and my mom promised me ice cream on the way home on Highway 24 between Clinton and Autryville in Roseboro. There was a little Hardee's, which we didn't get until I was about 9 or 10 years old. So this was a big deal, going to Hardee's and getting ice cream on the way home. Highway 24, by the way, connects Jacksonville, Camp Lejeune, and Fort Bragg, so it's sort of military main street there by two of the largest military installations in the world. Unfortunately, the state troopers were out that night patrolling us, and my mom was trying to get us to Hardee's before it closed. The state trooper had a different idea, so I missed out on my ice cream. And so I like to remind Mom of that story, that she still owes me ice cream for missing it that night. But little did I know then, but now I know so well, that I'd already gotten the real treat that night and that day, and that was getting a chance to learn and develop my skills in a youth organization that was going to push me a little bit out of my comfort zone and prepare me, frankly, to be an advocate for agriculture throughout the rest of my career. And so I think so highly of these organizations. I look forward to hearing the other presenters this morning. I'm going to try to avoid being an active listening. I'll try not to nod when I hear things I agree with. No grunting, doing that church grunt thing where you go, yeah. No fist clenching when I disagree, but I do look forward to the other panelists. I appreciate what they all bring to agriculture as well. So until next time, I hope your brackets remain perfect, your budgets become balanced, and in language that only this town can understand, I hope the Omni gives you everything you ever wanted and nothing you didn't. Good luck with that.
We're good. So Ray has graciously agreed to answer just a couple of quick questions, and we did have one that already came in from FFA, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first one, and that is because I was so fortunate to be one of the media folks that was enabled to visit with President Trump at the American Farm Bureau Federation convention in January, and he did such a great job with his speech. And he talked about all the different issues that were so important to ag and rural America, including crop insurance and trade and infrastructure. And then we got the budget. So I just was hoping maybe you could help square up a little bit some of the differences between what we saw in the president's budget and what we saw in January with his speech that really was quite a home run for the Farm Bureau members.
Sure. I hope it's apparent that Sarah didn't run this question by me ahead of time. But it's a fair question. And actually, it's a question I've answered before in the press room at the White House as we were preparing for another event over the course of the last quarter. Here's what I like to say. It's not anything that I believe folks in D.C. don't already know, folks that work in the ag policy realm. And that is, when the president produces a budget for Congress, he is doing that within the construct that he and the budget director have defined. And this time, that construct included trying to get the budget balanced, or as close to balanced as possible, over 10 years, adding $60 billion in increased military spending, and of course, a priority that he's talked about since day one on the campaign trail, building a wall. And so when you talk about building a budget around those constraints, you obviously, without touching entitlement programs, I would add, then you obviously are going to have places where you cut. I think if you look at what ended up on that piece of paper, ag did not take a disproportionate cut in that exercise. But more important than that, I think we recognize, and I've had these conversations at the White House with my fellow staff members on OMB and elsewhere, that for the most part, Congress is going to write the Farm Bill. And if we want to be relevant in that conversation, we have to be realistic about what our goals are. And with that said, if I can bring any comfort to this crowd, although I don't know that it's comfort because it's really an open question, the fact remains that when we talk about Farm Bill spending, we are talking about a bill that spends 80% of its budget on the SNAP program. And so when we think about priorities at the White House and priorities in terms of trimming the budget and trying to contain the cost curve, I would just assure you that while I do think farm programs will remain a vital part of that conversation, most of that conversation is probably going to focus on the part of the Farm Bill that actually costs the most. So that's my take on that. It may be a satisfactory or unsatisfactory answer, but I think what the President said in January remains. He supports crop insurance. The good thing about that was Chairman Roberts heard when he said that what he wanted to hear, and all the folks that want to cut crop insurance heard what they wanted to hear. The devil's going to be in the details, but certainly we don't want that program to go away. We know it's a phenomenal risk management tool, and we also know that when you start to play with the economics of it in terms of caps and lids and limits, that has an impact on the cost of the rest of the program. So all that will be a part of the conversation.
Thank you.
You bet.
And just one other quick question, and this comes from the FFA members who are in our audience, and they just want to know what the White House is doing to support ag education.
Yeah. Good question. And first of all, I hope the visibility piece, which I really believe in, I hope you see that. I think obviously we didn't have anything to do with making sure FFA is here, but we certainly have made sure FFA is at other events, like at the event yesterday with the Vice President, a strong presence out in Nashville at Zippy's meeting when the President spoke there. We had a National FFA officer sitting beside the President when he did the Farmer Roundtable. I've hosted the national officers into the White House on a West Wing tour this year, and we'll be happy to do that again. So visibility is important. People need to understand this organization is out there and what it stands for. I think beyond that, we have a real opportunity, because this is a president and this is an administration that really focuses and is talking about career and technical education. Many of the folks who feel like they've been left behind by the economic recovery that has largely been encapsulated in our urban areas, they are looking to programs like FFA, vocational training programs, our community colleges, our trade and industrial schools to find their way through this economy. And I think FFA brings a part of that conversation, our apprenticeship initiatives. I think there's a number of ways to plug in, and frankly, I think you all are doing that very, very well, I would say, Mark. I think you're playing well with the Department of Education, with USDA, and certainly with us at the White House on making sure you're plugged in at all of those levels. So my 2 cents on that. Again, I can't say enough about what this organization means to many, many, many people. It gave me my first trip to Raleigh, North Carolina, my first plane ride. I will forever be indebted to it. And the same to my parents and my family. I mentioned taking my mom. My mom was in town yesterday, actually, and I took her to the mess at the White House. Unfortunately, there were no prices on the menu, so she wasn't able to see what she was ordering was the most expensive thing. She got the ribeye, which was completely deplorable, but if the shoe fits. Anyway, we owe a lot to our families, we owe a lot to our farming communities, and certainly we owe a lot to organizations like 4-H and FFA. So we'll continue to look for those opportunities to be supportive. If I didn't touch on them, then bring those ideas to me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
You bet. My pleasure.
Help me in thanking Ray.